The time, the energy, the sound bites, the mental gymnastics of catering to a base who are more preoccupied with winning cultural wars. The retrograde energy being displayed is telling and threatens to send us back in time. I am talking about Florida's current governor. He does far too much for you not to know what his name is. But perhaps that is the point. Gin up the base, dangle the red meat before them as he teeters between whether or not to run for the highest office in the land. Florida is ground zero. Pay attention, folks. 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue could be next. Hello, and welcome back to The Conversation Piece with your host, Akila. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for, quote, fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. Governor DeSantis, some would argue, is becoming an increasingly authoritarian figure who is cherry-picking culture wars, especially targeting people of color, and who some would argue, again, is overreaching in his position as governor. Dubbed Trump with a brain, he and a Republican-controlled House and Senate in the state of Florida are actively pushing legislation that is zeroing in on education.
DeSantis has made a number of changes in both K through 12 and higher education. He announced a plan to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion programs on college campuses. Over the last couple of years, there has been a conservative push to focus more on education, and we've seen that play out with these reforms like what Governor DeSantis has implemented. New College of Florida, which is in Sarasota. That college DeSantis has targeted specifically because it's a small liberal arts college. He appointed 6 new members to the board of trustees that all lean very conservative, with a plan to carry out a conservative takeover of the college. Another issue is DeSantis's rejection of the advanced placement African American Studies course. He took issue with concepts such as intersectionality and Black queer studies. Governor DeSantis's goal is to eradicate these institutions of this quote-unquote woke ideology, and he's made that a huge tenet of his governorship to target anything he sees as being woke and potentially indoctrinating people into liberal views. However, critics would point out that this is nothing more than attempts to rile up his political base with an eye for a widely expected presidential run in 2024. We've seen states start to emulate and copy legislation and policies enacted by DeSantis in the Florida legislature. Several states passed their own versions of the Don't Say Gay law, restricting classroom instruction around gender and sexual orientation. There's also some concern that these higher education reforms will also begin to be emulated by other states. It already has had a ripple effect around the country, and it will only continue from here.
The University of Chicago has a mandate called the Chicago Principles, which defend open discourse and freedom of expression. In 2020, DeSantis agreed with Florida's 40 state public college and universities on those principles. In the Chicago Principle mandate, it states that, quote, debate or deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forth are thought by some or even by most members of the university to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed, end quote. It seems that the governor has done a 180 turn on the principle as he calls himself pushing back against woke culture.
We reject woke ideology. We fight the woke in the legislature. We fight the woke in the schools. We fight the woke in the corporations. We will never, ever surrender to the woke mob. Florida is where woke goes to die.
Suzanne Nossel, CEO of PEN America, wrote an opinion piece called Ron DeSantis Abandons Former First Amendment Defense. In it she writes, quote, "He feels that progressive academia is an attempt to really delegitimize our history and delegitimize our institutions," end quote. She also states that, quote, "DeSantis is not wrong to point out that progressive orthodoxies can sometimes stifle opposing views, but a principle is not a principle unless it is extended to all, and DeSantis now seems bent on using the power of his office to apply free speech protections only to those ideas he supports. Indeed, in pushing back against what he decries as wokeness run amok, DeSantis has embraced the very tactics he once decried, putting the weight of government power behind efforts to repress viewpoints that offend him and his supporters," end quote. Nossel also wrote, quote, "Progressives too often forget that the movements they wage, whether for racial justice, gender justice, climate, or anything else, depend upon free speech protections to guarantee the space for dissent, and that such protections must apply equally to speech, with which they disagree. Some fail to acknowledge, too, that the worthwhile perspectives and solutions can emerge from outside their own ideological spheres, but the cure that DeSantis and his backers favor, intrusive legislation to muzzle the opposite set of views, is worse than a disease. State-ordered legal bans based on viewpoint, whether ideas on CRT, books depicting LGBTQ or diverse programs, strike at the heart of what the First Amendment protects," end quote. Let's look at some of the laws before I dig into education. April 14, 2022, Florida enacted the 15-week abortion law ban, and recently he hinted that he would sign a 6-week abortion bill if it passed. November 4, 2022, he signed into law banning transgender healthcare treatment for minors. He also signed into law allowing Florida drivers to run over protesters without fear of the driver being held liable. The anti-riot law passed while the nation protested peacefully for the most part against police brutality in the wake of the death of George Floyd. The law is vague in language, but dangerous in scope. It is dangerous to protest en masse of any kind. Participation in a, quote, riot is a felony. Mob intimidation is defined as 3 or more people attempting to change a person's viewpoint through the threat of violence. The destruction of any memorials, including Confederate memorials, is punishable up to 15 years in prison. Blocking a highway is a felony offense. And as stated, there is civil immunity for drivers who run over protesters unlawfully congregating in a street. The anti-riot law supposedly, quote, strengthens penalties against those it deems rioters, end quote. A judge issued a preliminary injunction blocking key parts of the law from being enforced because the argument is that it could, quote, criminalize legal, protected speech, end quote, and the bill is, quote, vague to the point of unconstitutionality, end quote. Protesting is a right afforded to every American under the First Amendment, which reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, let's shift towards education. House Bill 1557 is the Parental Rights in Education, or what has been dubbed the, quote, Don't Say Gay Bill. Section 3 of the bill reads, quote, a school district may not encourage classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender orientation in kindergarten through grades 3. He now seeks to extend that through K through 12. House Bill, page 13, section B reads, quote, a state university is prohibited from using diversity, equity, and inclusion statements, CRT, or other forms of political identity filters as part of the hiring process, including as part of the applications for employment, promotion and tenure, conditions of employment, or reviewing qualifications for employment. HB 999 also, quote, aims to prohibit universities or colleges from using any funds to promote, support, maintain any programs or campus activities that support or adopt diversity, equity, and inclusion, end quote. This directly affects BIPOC people. Did they stop and consider why Black people in particular needed to establish their own colleges and universities to begin with? Because they were not permitted in white establishments.
A lot of people who aren't Black don't understand and I didn't until I went to college, but the important institutions that historically Black fraternities and sororities are for Black students, and the opportunities they create for those students to create a network and get jobs once they graduate college. So people typically think of sororities and fraternities as just, getting drunk, going to parties, whatever. But one of the most important aspects of Greek life is creating a network of people that you can connect with after you graduate, when you're applying for jobs, when you're applying for, grants, programs, scholarships. That is imperative, especially for Black people in America who have, historically been discriminated against, continue to be discriminated against in employment, in education. These are important resources for those students. And, of course, there's this idea that, he says it's not going to impact Black fraternities and sororities. They can say that, but that doesn't change the fact that it will have a chilling effect on the way that these institutions operate in the state of Florida. They'll be fearful, of doing fundraising for the organizations, or even having the organizations on campus. And the colleges, out of fear of violating this bill and stopping receiving funds for their schools, are going to be apprehensive if a chapter tries to open on a campus for one of these fraternities. They're going to have to think twice about it. Whereas if it's a white fraternity or sorority, they won't have to make that same consideration, which is, it's just a racist bill. It's just based on racism. That's it. There's no benefit to this whatsoever, educationally, institutionally, otherwise. If you're banning DEI from the classrooms, in the first hand, you're, preparing your students worse than other colleges to go out into the world. On the other hand, you're also opening your school up for more lawsuits and having the taxpayers pay out more settlements for these public institutions, because a huge part of DEI at universities, and particularly in the workplace, is it's a piece of evidence you can introduce if you're being sued for discrimination. We have these programs in place. We teach our employees and our students, how to navigate the world in a more inclusive way. Now they don't have that piece of evidence to introduce. That's going to lead to more lawsuits, more settlements, more taxpayer money being paid out for instances of racism on college campuses. So all around, there's just no benefit to it. It's just racism.
House Bill 999, page 16, section C reads, model civil discourse that recognizes the importance of viewpoint diversity, intellectual rigor, and evidence-based approach to history. Page 19, section C reads, general education courses may not suppress or distort significant historical events or include a curriculum that teaches identity politics, such as critical race theory, or defines American history as contrary to the creation of a new nation based on universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. Now, let's focus on the language, as it is the language and messaging that is important. Page 16 mentions the importance of viewpoint diversity. The wording of viewpoint diversity is the same conceptual analysis that they want to eliminate. Diversity in its very definition is to become enlarged or varied, whether through diversity of personnel, diversity of thought. The varying of lived experiences that an individual or a group can bring to a homogeneous group is beneficial. The Stop Woke Act restricts the ways concepts related to systemic racism and sex discrimination can be discussed in schools. House Bill 999 takes it further as it seeks to limit the educational capacities of faculties and students. Part of the bill suggests that history now, quote, suppress or distort significant historical events. Going back to page 19 of House Bill 999, Section C, general education courses may not suppress or distort significant historical events or include a curriculum that teaches identity politics, such as critical race theory, or defines American history as contrary to the creation of a new nation based on universal principles stated in a Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence reads, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, the Declaration of Independence was ratified back on July 4th, 1776. And truthfully, Black people in this country were still enslaved and were not even considered a person. See, after the ratification of the Declaration of Independence, constitutional conventions would later follow, and in one, Black people's personhood was debated, and a compromise was reached, the 3-5 Compromise. The 3-5 Compromise is that in slave-holding states, 3 out of 5 enslaved people would count as a person. Was this done with the enslaved's, quote, independence, equity, or inalienable rights in mind? No. The 3-5 Compromise was a way for the South to leverage their voting powers and increase their population count. This plays out heavily with the Southern electors having electoral voting influence in presidential elections even to this day. Now, would a teacher be able to teach this in class? For that significant historical event still has lingering effects today. Did it sound as if there was any distortion or suppression of that significant historical event? How about we have more context and language from a person who was debating during the Constitutional Convention? A person that is not even taught or mentioned in the textbooks. I am referring to the person who wrote the final draft of the Constitution. No, not James Madison, as we are erroneously taught in school. Meet Mr. Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris put forth this diverse viewpoint. Quote, "Upon what principle is that the slaves should be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. The admission of the slaves in the representation, when fairly explained, comes to this, that the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina, who goes to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages, shall have more votes in government instituted for protection of rights of manhood than the citizens of Pennsylvania or New Jersey, who views with laudable horror so nefarious a practice. Domestic slavery is the most prominent feature in the aristocratic countenance of this proposed Constitution." End quote. Do you feel some type of way? Is that good or bad? Are you thinking? I hope so. Hey you. Yeah, I'm talking to you. Do you have Spotify? If so, turn on the notification button. You can also find the Conversation Piece podcast on Google Podcast, iHeartRadio, Pocket Cast, RadioPublic.com, Breaker.audio, and Anchor.fm/Akila Lynch, spelled AQUILA-LYNCH. Thank you for your support. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for, quote, fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. Policies and law, drawn up out of feelings instead of logical, practical, and fair implementation, is going to have real-life consequences, and it will cost the state financially, as Florida is now being sued by 3 brilliant high school students, who you will hear in their entirety in this segment. But first, Attorney Craig Wisenhunt explaining that this tactic is nothing new, but it can be defeated.
Good afternoon. I know that everyone's truly excited to hear technical legal arguments at the end of a lot of rousing speeches, but bear with me. I want to start by pointing out that one of the reasons this lawsuit is so important is because if we do not learn from our history, we are doomed to repeat it. And we have been here before. And Ron DeSantis clearly did not learn from history. Back in 2010, a Republican-led government in Arizona tried this very same thing regarding Mexican-American studies. And it took years, nearly 7, before a federal court shut that down. Because the government doesn't get to entangle itself in the education of students when it comes to a point of view. There are equal protections under the law. And this effort by the governor disproportionately affects only some.
Yep.
Right? There are protections to content-oriented speech. And this only intends to limit some content. Right? The content that applies to African American studies and African American students, these are black communities. It doesn't speak to the traditions of white America, only that which Governor DeSantis seems to take exception to, which seems to be time and time again the minorities in the state of Florida.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Okay. Dear Governor DeSantis, this is not a school assignment or random spewings from a kid who doesn't know anything, but this is a factual account of how I personally feel about your decision to deny me and my fellow students our rightfully deserved AP African American Studies class. But first, let me introduce myself. I'm Elijah Edwards. I'm a lamplighter, community leader, and 10th grade gifted and magnet student at Sale High School. As I have gone through my years of schooling as a black kid in Florida, I have realized that I have not learned much about the history or culture of my people outside of my parents and close relatives. This fact unsettled me for some time. But after I heard that there might be an African American Studies AP class, I was ecstatic because next year I will be taking AP classes and wanted that class to be one of them. I could already imagine the insightful discussions and daily new history facts. But instead of approving the class and giving me and my fellow students around Florida a glimmer of hope to learn about the roots of our lineage, Governor DeSantis decided to deny the potentially life-changing class and effectively censor the freedom of our education and shield us from the truths of our ancestors. I can't believe that this is 2023 and America is talking about censoring education. This is America, not a communist nation. I thought here in this country, we believed in the free exchange of ideas, not the suppression of it. I don't expect much to change in Mr. DeSantis' mind, but he has the power to work with the College Board to approve the valuable curriculum that is so desperately needed. I hope he does. It would make it so Florida students have the opportunity to expand their horizons and learn about not only their cultures, but those of their classmates. This diversity is what makes both Florida and America so wonderful and unique.
Good afternoon. My name is Juliet Heckman, and I'm a junior at Leon High School here in Tallahassee, Florida. Over the past 2.5 years, I've had the privilege of taking 4 AP courses, 3 of which have been history-related. These classes have further advanced my knowledge of the world around me, as each class offers thorough evidence, viewpoints, and reasoning based on its designated topic. When I heard the news that there was an AP course in the works that was designated specifically to African American studies, I was grateful. Grateful in the sense that this side of history, one which is notoriously ignored and disregarded, would finally be given the proper and sufficient representation that it deserves. I was grateful that there was an interdisciplinary course that not only goes into depth on the history of African Americans, but also emphasizes the contributions made by them that have built the foundation of our country itself. Now, you can only imagine how me and many of my classmates felt when we recently learned that because we live in the state of Florida, we would not be given the opportunity to take this course because it, and I quote, lacks educational value. Every single AP course that I have taken has significantly advanced my knowledge and understanding of our world and has inspired me to learn more, and I have full confidence that this course would be no different. Simply because Florida lawmakers may be uncomfortable or even afraid with the course's criteria because it is too woke, does not grant them the right to take away this opportunity from thousands of students across the state. Times are changing, education is expanding, and students have higher levels of curiosity than ever before. It is not fair for our education to be constricted under the ignorant opinions of those who reject a course that is designed to only advance our understanding of the world around us. This is not a course of indoctrination. It's a course that dives deep into the history, culture, arts, literature, and advancements that African Americans have and continue to make in our country. A greater understanding of this honest history is necessary in order to fully comprehend our country's origins and the contributions that have been made to lead us to where we are today.
The Florida Department of Education informed the College Board that its AP African American Studies course, quote, significantly lacks educational value. And in the future, should the College Board be willing to come back to the table with lawful, historically accurate content, the Florida Department of Education will always be willing to reopen the discussion, end quote. Now, the governor is threatening to do away with the College Board altogether, which may sound confusing when considering that the state of Florida ranks very high in the nation in AP participation. He is quoted as saying this, quote, nobody elected the College Board to do anything. They have provided these AP courses for a long time. But there are probably some other vendors who may be able to do the job as good or maybe even a lot better, end quote. So it sounds like he wants to pick his own board who share his views. The letter also asserted that the course was, quote, inexplicably contrary to Florida law, but did not explain how it was counter to Florida law. Florida Education Commissioner Manny Diaz Jr. took to Twitter to explain that. He tweeted, quote, despite the lies from the Biden White House, Florida rejected an AP course filled with CRT and other obvious violations of Florida law. We proudly require the teaching of African American history. We do not accept woke indoctrination masquerading as education, end quote. The topics of concern were on intersectionality, Black queer studies, Black Lives Matter, Black feminist literary thought, reparations, and Black study and struggle in the 21st century. In all transparency, the concerns were listed next to the topics with their cited authors. But this is more than just banning history and authors. When this much energy and time is spent trying to devalue and silence groups of people, especially people of color, then you know the value of that information is important. The energy and time for condemnation should make people wonder what anxiety and fear is lying underneath this aggression to suppress information. What is it that you do not want the masses of people to know? Is this about woke indoctrination?
Hello, my name is Victoria McQueen, and I am a junior at Leon High School right here in Tallahassee, Florida. I have taken 6 advanced placement courses, each having a different impact on my academic life. I am also a dual enrollment student at Tallahassee Community College. Taking this many rigorous classes has opened my eyes to the wide variety of topics from histories to science, even the criminal justice system. Opening the possibility to yet another AP, one that a diverse demographic has the potential to want to learn, will expand the knowledge of many students, myself included. In today's political climate, many topics related to Black history have been prohibited. Therefore, there are many gaps in American history regarding the African American population. The implementation of an AP African American history class will fill in those gaps. My generation is a heavily social media based one, with so many opinions and not nearly enough facts. When there are those historical gaps, students turn to the internet and social media to fill in those necessary gaps, not getting the factual-based information.
Tell it.
This course will open that opportunity to learn facts and is something that students should at least have the option to do. Learning about the death of Emmett Till, a young man who is not much younger than I am when he was lynched, is something that every child at their own discretion should learn.
Yes.
Because even as it is terrible history, it is the American history of an African American.
Wow.
Then there's the Tulsa Race Massacre, also known as the Black Wall Street Massacre. Something I had to learn on my own time because we don't learn that horrific history in APUS. Lucky for me, my parents would fill in the gaps and give information, but those are big events in American history that should be taught to all, not just the ones who want to gain a deeper knowledge of the issue. Not to mention the outstanding leaders of history that aren't discussed, such as John Lewis, a progressive for many African Americans, being a trailblazer through society and leaving a forever impact on this country. Whew. Along with Lewis, there is another pioneer that does not get the credit she deserves. Henrietta Lacks is the name.
Come on.
Being one who dealt with medical racism as a deceased individual because of how historic she was, goes to show the treatments of blacks in this country, something that history books would never tell students about. Being the first to have regenerating cells and dying a terrible death, scientists then use her cells for their own gain, not even consulting her family, representing how oppressed and disregarded in America African Americans are, even though she was and continues to be a catalyst in modern day medicine. Many students don't have the great opportunity to know about these events and people, so a course needs to be dedicated to give the chance to learn and gather an understanding of a different culture there is. Certainly, there are other advanced placement histories such as AP European History, AP US History, and AP World History, all predominantly generated towards white people. By lacking an AP dedicated to the ones this country was built off the backs of, is further oppressing a group that has done more for this country than the country has done for them. Stealing the right for students to gather knowledge on a history that many want to know about because it's a political agenda goes to show that some don't want the horrors this country has done to African Americans to finally come to light. Also, when students learn all the basics, students learn just enough to get by, but don't have to consider the trauma that will forever be engraved in this country's history. My Floridian classmates and I are being deprived by not getting this course, and we feel that we should be able to make the decision of whether or not to take advanced placement African American history. Thank you.
Jason Stanley wrote an article in The Guardian entitled, "Banning Ideas and Authors is not a cultural war, it's fascism." He wrote, quote, "The passing of these laws signal the dawn of a new authoritarian age in the United States, where the state uses laws restricting speech to intimidate, bully, and punish educators, forcing them to submit to the ideology of the dominant majority or lose their livelihoods or even their freedom." End quote.
A former Duval County teacher is talking with us about his decision to leave the state in frustration with the recent state laws and restrictions that prevent teachers from including certain class material to students.
On your side, Sailor Levesque is joining us live from Duval County Public Schools headquarters about why he decided it was best to resign and relocate. Taylor.
The former Sandalwood High School teacher told me he feels Florida teachers are being demonized instead of credited for using their knowledge of historical and present-day events to teach students inside the classroom. Eventually, he says he decided enough is enough. From the Don't Say Gay bill, the Stop Woke Act, and now the state's blocking of the AP African American Studies class, former Duval County High School African American History and AP Government teacher Alex Ingram accuses Governor Ron DeSantis of showing hostility towards educators when deciding to block AP African American Studies from being taught in Florida high schools.
We are talking about America in both in positive and negative lights. I think the governor would like to have a race-blind society where they say, oh, black people and white people are perfectly equal. And that is the ideal under the law, but in practice, the hundreds of years of history have made it such that economically, that simply is not the case.
PEN America Senior Manager of Free Expression and Education, Jeremy Young, says teachers are experts in the subjects they teach, and denying some topics to be taught in classrooms is a threat of free expression.
The goal is not to make students agree with any of these ideas, but to help students understand what they are and where they come from, so that even if students disagree, they can have a more informed understanding of what these ideas are as they move into adulthood.
Ingram resigned from his position at Sandalwood High School in January and recently moved to Connecticut to teach African American history.
There's a lot more resources available.
A lot of this pushback started with the 1619 Project, which I will discuss in an upcoming episode. Pushback on Black history is not new. In 1925, white segregationists in Oklahoma asserted that Carter G. Woodson, the man that started Black History Week, his book entitled, quote, "The Negro in Our History." Oppositionists thought that it was anti-Klan. Anti-Klan is not a misquote. They did not want a book instilled in the schools that was either Klan or anti-Klan. CRT, or critical race theory, was established in the 1970s. It is a legal theory by legal scholars examining society through a legal framework, and put forth the notion that racism did not go away. It never left. It simply changed face and is being upheld through institutions such as housing, banking, policing, education, healthcare, employment, policy, and law. That racism is a caste system that is systemic and institutional.
This theory just says, let's pay attention to what has happened in this country and how what has happened in this country is continuing to create differential outcomes so we can become that country that we say we are. So critical race theory is not anti-patriotic. In fact, it is more patriotic than those who are opposed to it, because we believe in the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendment. We believe in the promises of equality, and we know we can't get there if we can't confront and talk honestly about inequality.
Before I sign off, the question should be raised: why are we as a country afraid to examine societal constructs holistically from all sides, especially history? Even the word history, his story. School cannot teach us everything, but whose stories make it into the textbooks and the way they are written speak volumes about who we are, who we value and prioritize in society. That hierarchy historically has existed and still affects us today through policy that is written and laws that are passed. Education is not meant to make you comfortable. It is meant to make you think, and that includes children. I will end with a James Baldwin quote. Quote, "The paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which one is being educated." End quote. That sounds about woke to me. Here's a preview of the next episode.
Christopher, you first. Yeah, that's absolutely right. This is one of the biggest kind of misconceptions. You can teach about slavery, discrimination, and racism without using critical race theory. Critical race theory, in simple terms, is an academic discipline that holds that the United States was founded on racism, white supremacy, and patriarchy, and that those forces are still at the root of our society today. Critical race theory reformulates the old Marxist dichotomy of oppressor and oppressed, but it replaces the class categories of bourgeoisie and proletariat with the racial categories of white and black. And if you look at the academic literature, the critical race theorists aren't merely saying we should examine the history of racial inequality or racial injustice. They're saying things that are much deeper. They call into question the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. They call into question the First Amendment right to free speech. They oppose capitalism and believe that a system of collectivism must be implemented in order to improve society. It's not a benign philosophy about teaching racism. It's a radical philosophy that's rooted in Marxism and is frankly inappropriate as a pedagogical framework for teaching children.
Thank you again for tuning in to another episode of the Conversation Piece Podcast. I am your humble host, Akila, requesting that you join me again. So, until then, be safe, love, and value yourself so that you can love and value others. I bid you adieu with the greeting, Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you.